period is more familiar to a lot of you because this is the one that you've been paying attention to. I won't go into a big definition of gene editing. The most famous gene editing tool, CRISPR. Here's a little cartoon explanation of it. Basically, the system consists of a targeting mechanism that finds the right place in the genome, and then a scissors cutting mechanism, a sort of molecular scissors that's been called, to cut the double strand of the DNA, delete some DNA sequence, replace it with another. The term gene editing, I think, does some important work in sort of suggesting a little bit about how this technique works. But I think it's also misleading in that if you're editing, it's to make us think about word processing, right? But if you're using a word processing software platform on your document, you make a change in one place, you wouldn't expect to see that change show up somewhere else, pages later in the document next month. And the biological equivalent of that can happen with these gene editing tools, at least at this point. Here are some of the developers. These people are Jennifer Doudna, Emmanuel Charpentier, and Feng Zheng. They are named often as possible Nobel Prize recipients for their work developing CRISPR. They're also in a huge patent fight with each other, as you probably know. This issue kind of broke open in the spring last year. This was in March, so just 12 months ago. This was an article in MIT Technology Review that first reported in a relatively popular journal about the rumors that scientists in various labs were going to use gene editing on human embryos and what that signified for the possibility of creating genetically modified human beings. This prompted many articles to be written, and here are just a few of the first ones. This was in Nature. This article was authored by biotech industry executives. It was titled, "Don't Edit the Human Germline," and the authors pointed out that there are serious risks and the therapeutic benefits are tenuous, and that it would be a path towards genetic enhancement. They were pretty unequivocal about their position, and it was quite interesting that this was people from the biotech industry who want to develop gene editing as gene therapy and don't want a lot of political controversy they don't want backlash that would impede those developments and turn people against them. And I think they're quite sincere in what they're saying here as well. A different point of view was put out in Science magazine, and this was the more research scientist crowd, David Baltimore, Paul Berg, people who have been involved in this field for decades. This group was brought together by Jennifer Doudna, and in Science they published an article titled "A Prudent Path Forward for Genomic Engineering and Germline Gene Modification." These developments were reported in the New York Times. That's there. And shortly after these articles came out, scientists from Sun Yat-sen University reported in a relatively obscure journal, actually, because Nature and Science didn't want to publish it, about their experiment editing human embryos using CRISPR. They used embryos from a fertility clinic that were not viable, that could never develop into a human being. And that was part of how they saw themselves as doing this in an ethical way. And the experiment was really an interesting experiment in that it failed. They had a lot of what they called off-target mutations. They had mosaicism, meaning that different cells in the embryo, the editing worked differently. So, but it was the first time that this had been done to anyone's knowledge, and it was a big deal. That's why it's front page of the New York Times. And then you got reactions from all these agencies of the United States, the National Institutes of Health, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, issuing statements saying we're not going to do this, giving various reasons for it. And the National Academies of Sciences said, okay, we're going to take this on and we're going to put together this summit, they called it. And that was what happened last December, the International Summit on Human Gene Editing. And they invited as hosting organizations, the Royal Society of the UK and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They trying to make it international, as the title says, but tellingly, I think, they did not invite any science academies in any European countries or from the Council of Europe where there is an established policy regime prohibiting germline modification. Well, what happened at this meeting? 500 or so people came to it. I was very, pleased to be invited to speak there, but I was not so happy that the Center for Genetics and Society was the only public interest organization that was represented there on the podium. And so we didn't hear from any of the civil society constituencies that I mentioned, the people who are focusing on social justice, people who are focusing on inequality, on disability rights, on racial justice, on civil liberties. None of those voices were present. And the summit was not designed to produce a consensus among the participants, but at the end, the committee that organized the summit did issue a statement that got a lot of attention and coverage, even though the concluding statement was actually quite inconclusive. Not surprising, I suppose. The statement says that germline gene editing for reproduction has not been shown to be safe or effective. That's kind of the mainstream view, that it's not safe right now. And so it would be irresponsible to proceed for that reason. But the statement did leave the door open to reconsider that down the road. It said, as scientific knowledge advances and societal views evolve, the clinical use of germline editing should be revisited on a regular basis. So in other words, they kicked the can down the road. They also did say something very important, which was that it would be irresponsible to proceed unless and until a broad societal consensus about the appropriateness of the proposed application could be reached. A broad societal consensus. Now that's unusual language for a body like this. And what does it mean? No one has any idea what it means. So I think we do know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that elite scientists or elite policymakers, for that matter, meeting in small groups should make this decision. That it's a decision that really requires thoughtful, extended in time, meaningfully inclusive, broadly inclusive conversation and set of deliberations about how these technologies should be used, whether they should be used at all for future generations. And I think it is going to be up to people like all of us in this room to make sure that that's what happened. So I want to leave time for questions, but what I think I want to do is just give you in the nutshell the way that we at the Center for Genetics and Society, and again, we're echoing what we hear from around the world, and our colleagues, we do work with a pretty wide network at this point of scholars in a range of disciplines and civil society advocates from a range of constituencies. So the argument that we think makes sense against human germline modification is, first of all, it's not safe right now. It may never be safe, but not safe right now, that's totally mainstream. The second piece is it's not really medically necessary. It's often argued that this is a way to prevent the transmission of genetic diseases to the next generation, but here's a really important point. It's not needed for that in almost every case. We have technologies already, embryo screening technologies, that themselves raise some ethical questions, certainly, but that are far safer for the resulting child and far less, put society at far less risk than would germline genetic modification. So there will be a handful of people who cannot produce unaffected embryos, but we're really talking about a handful, tiny number. And everyone who's at risk of passing on a genetic disease can have a healthy, unaffected child if they are willing to use somebody else's eggs or sperm. So the whole argument for it depends on the fact that the desire of parents, not just for an unaffected child, but for a child genetically related to both members of the couple, is more important than any of these risks, even more important than the risks that they would be putting their child to, which it's hard for me to understand, but that's the way the argument goes. The other piece of the argument that's important is that, if you could imagine that maybe that there would be some kind of policy regime where the use of germline genetic modification could be limited just to those handful of people who had no other way to have an unaffected and genetically related child. But you'd have to have a pretty good imagination to imagine that, because in the real world, once you open the door to one kind of germline modification, I think you'd be opening it to all kinds. This is, you know, the FDA can't even regulate off-label uses of drugs. And this would be what that would be. It would be like an off-label use of germline genetic modification, not to prevent the transmission of Tay-Sachs or Huntington's disease, but, you know, to start out, it would be the things that scientists are talking about now, fast twitch muscles so you can be a better sprinter, stronger bones so you could be a better weightlifter, need less sleep. There's a gene that's very strongly correlated with needing a lot less sleep. And so you would be starting to get these enhancements for parents who could afford them. You would be starting to get these fertility clinics with ad copy like the one that Lee Silver imagined in 1999. You would get competition within societies. You would get competition between societies. These commercial dynamics, I think, would be very powerful. And I think it would be all too likely that we would find ourselves in a world in which we were exacerbating existing kinds of discrimination and inequality and putting entirely new kinds of discrimination and inequality into the world. I think we already have enough of that. We don't need more. So I think we should keep human germline modification as a no-go zone. So I'll stop there and hope that we can talk about this and talk about some of the maybe social issues, ethical issues, safety issues, anything that you would like to comment on or ask about.
So I have a couple of questions. The first is, I'm only 19. Do you think that the Global Summit advocated that we maybe revisit this over time? Do you think this will become an issue that I'm going to have to worry about later on down the road? Or is this going to take a much longer time to develop? What's the timeline that you realistically can see with this?
That's a really interesting question. I think we have a very critical window right now over the next couple of years. The National Academies, in addition to putting on this summit, has also struck another committee that's writing what they call a consensus report. And we don't know, they're having a series of meetings, hearing from panels of different kinds, and they'll issue a report toward the end of this year, is their anticipation. So this is a really critical year, but there are also starting to be conversations in other parts of the world. I have a feeling it is going to not be settled finally, no matter what happens, and it is going to keep going on. I mean, you know, it's in the past, even as recently as 15 years ago when I got involved in this, it was hypothetical. I mean, some people thought it was way far out in the future. But now we're at a point where, you know, we can do it. And this gene editing technology is really exciting. It's thrilling. It's so powerful. Scientists are so excited. And, you know, for some really good reasons about what they can do and some wonderful things that they can do. But there's also the fact that you can really think about practically trying to create genetically modified people. It means that I think we have to really have very clear public policy. And even then, I think, yes, I think it's something that's going to be with us for your adult life.